friends. Welcome back to Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick, your host. I'm podcasting today from Tacoma, Washington, aka Grit City, and the traditional lands of the Puyallup people. Today, I want to talk about foraging, not as a hobby, not as a quirky urban trend, but as a living, contested practice that sits at the intersection of ecology, culture, law, and survival. Foraging is one of humanity's oldest relationships with land. Long before zoning codes, park rules, or the language of resource management, people gathered food, medicine, fibers, and fuel from the landscapes they lived in. This wasn't extraction. It was a relationship. It was seasonal, careful, and guided by knowledge passed through families, elders, and places. And here I want to say everyone's ancestors had this relationship. Yet today, foraging is criminalized on Earth, across the globe, and right here in the Pacific Northwest. People are fined, surveilled, or excluded for doing something their ancestors did for thousands of years. This episode is about how that happened. We'll look at international case studies, local examples from Seattle and Tacoma, nearby to me, and a language that justifies exclusion. We'll also talk about how some agencies are trying, imperfectly but sincerely, to do better. And we'll ground all of this in ecological restoration, justice, livelihoods, and human health. And I think this is important to restoration because we emphasize social ecological systems, equity, and long-term relationships with place. Restoration that excludes people, especially those whose livelihoods and health depend on land, is incomplete. Restoration that excludes people is incomplete, especially when we throw up barriers to those whose livelihoods and health depend on land. Foraging, when practiced with care, can strengthen restoration outcomes. Deeper monitoring, cultural continuity, stewardship rooted in use, not distance. I want to begin with a plant that's very good at surviving pressure, za'atar. Not the spice blend on the shelf, but the plants living behind it. Anyway, the reason why I bring this episode to you is because I ran out of za'atar. It's this tasty spice that I bought in a package. For so long, I'd cruise by this store on the corner of Proctor and South 19th. I popped in there and I was like, they gotta have it. I grabbed the last package on the wall. It was like $6.99. Paid my money and I left. If you're used to buying spices at a store off a shelf, we really don't think about what the actual really living plant looks like. It's both a plant and a food tradition, depending on context. At its root, za'atar refers to a group of wild aromatic plants in the mint family, commonly wild thyme or oregano relatives, often Oreganum syriacum, that grow low to the ground in rocky, dry landscapes across the Levant. These plants are perennial, drought-tolerant, and deeply adapted to human harvest. The word often refers to the culinary blend made from dried wild za'atar leaves mixed with sesame seeds, salt, and sometimes sumac. It's eaten with olive oil and bread, sprinkled on vegetables, or used as a daily staple, especially in Palestinian, Lebanese, Syrian, and Jordanian cuisines. Za'atar is more than a flavor. It's food, medicine, and cultural memory. Traditionally, it's used to aid digestion, support respiratory health, and sharpen focus, and it has long been gathered through careful seasonal harvesting. That everyday practice, gathering za'atar from the land, is at the center of many contemporary debates about conservation, access, and food sovereignty. Tar doesn't need tending in the way we usually imagine care. It needs relationship, rotational harvest, restraint, memory. For Palestinians, za'atar is food, medicine, culture. And for decades, gathering it has been illegal. So in relation to the current Israeli occupation of Palestine, this story is not new. Beginning in the late 1970s, Israeli authorities designated wild za'atar and akub, a spring thistle, as protected species. The official reason was conservation, overharvesting, and biodiversity loss. But enforcement has overwhelmingly targeted Palestinians practicing everyday foodways. This is where I want us to slow down, because za'atar didn't suddenly become fragile. What changed was who had authority over land, knowledge, and access. Here's something restoration science is finally catching up to. Many of the plants we claim to be protecting evolved alongside human harvest. Fire-adapted berries, coppice trees, pruned shrubs, tended meadows, managed, not in the bureaucratic sense, but in the relational sense. Za'atar is perennial if you harvest it properly, taking a little, leaving the woody base, rotating patches, it responds with vigor. A cube is gathered young, before flowering, with attention to future seed. These are not careless practices. These are long-term ecological strategies, mixed with culture. This matters because restoration recognizes that ecology isn't just about species and structure. It is about people, relationship, and benefits. A couple principles I live by as a certified ecological restoration practitioner is engaging stakeholders or rights holders, as well as believing in multiple knowledge systems. The social benefits framework names things like traditional ecological knowledge is reinforced, sense of place is strengthened, local livelihoods are supported. So foraging sits squarely inside that wheel of social benefits. There's a word that almost never appears in park codes, but shows up everywhere in lived practice. Usufruct. Usufruct. I don't exactly know how to say it. I mumble a lot, so that's my accent coming out. The right to use and benefit from land without owning it and without destroying it. Usufruct is ancient. It exists in Roman law, indigenous legal systems, peasant commons, and customary foodways across the world. Usufruct says, you can eat from this place, and this place will still be here. Modern conservation law often replaces usufruct with permits, prohibitions, and professionalized management. And that word, quote-unquote management, does a lot of quiet work. So za'atar is not an anomaly, it's a pattern. And looking at other international case studies, some of which I'm not going to go into detail about, but you're free to read more about them. And you may even know more about them than me, and I'd love to hear from you. In the United Kingdom, gathering wild plants and mushrooms for personal use is generally legal. Selling them is not. The law distinguishes livelihood scale extraction from subsistence and cultural use. In France and Italy, foraging is culturally normal and legally visible. You see it manifested in permits and daily weight limits, even in protected areas. It can be punitive, but it does not pretend foraging doesn't exist. In Nordic countries, every man's rights allow people to gather berries and mushrooms on most lands, regardless of ownership, as long as they don't cause damage. That's usufruct written into law. In Singapore, however, public foraging is widely prohibited and socially stigmatized, shaped by state ownership and conservation narratives that equate access with risk. Across these contexts, the same question appears again and again. Is foraging treated as a relationship or as a threat? In the United States, foraging law is layered and inconsistent. On National Park Service lands, the default is prohibition. Plants, fungi, even fallen materials are protected unless the superintendent explicitly allows limited harvest. That permission lives in superintendent compendiums, documents most park visitors never see. But, and this matters, the National Park Service has also been working unevenly and imperfectly to do better. The Tribal Leader's Guide to NPS Plant Gathering explicitly acknowledges that many plants in parks are part of ongoing indigenous food, medicine, and cultural systems, not relics of the past. That guide doesn't magically fix access, but it names the truth. Parks exist on indigenous lands, and conservation cannot ignore that. And walking this down the hierarchy, Washington state parks allow limited recreational harvest of edible plants and fungi, up to 2 gallons per person per day unless otherwise posted. They also state clearly that these rules are not intended to limit treaty rights. That sentence is not small. It acknowledges that some relationships to land predate the park, the state, and the law itself. So let's bring this home, for me anyway. In Seattle, Parks Code generally prohibits removal of plants, fungi, and plant parts. Yet at the same time, the city supports places like the Beacon Food Forest, which is public food on public land. In Tacoma, Park Code has historically prohibited removal of any plant material, with possession itself treated as evidence of violation. Here's the tension. The rules were written to stop large-scale damage, perhaps, but they're enforced at the scale of individual bodies. A handful of berries, illegal. Medicinal leaves, illegal. Fallen branches, illegal. And enforcement is not evenly distributed. People of color, unhoused people, immigrants, and indigenous folks are far more likely to be questioned, cited, or removed. Here's where the story complicates, and I want to be honest about that. There's some chatter about Tacoma's urban agricultural plan, which explicitly calls for developing food foraging opportunities on park property, updating conduct codes, prioritizing tribal preferences, and creating edible landscapes. This doesn't erase the harm of past policies, but it does signal movement. It acknowledges that blanket prohibitions don't work and that food access, culture, and health belongs in parks. The challenge now is alignment, making sure new policies don't reproduce old dynamics under softer language. And this is, I think, where our fascination with language matters. Words like management, stewardship, best practices, resource protection, these are what linguist Uwe Porksen called plastic words. And I learned about this from Claire Fullman's new book, Scapegoat. And I think it's a tension we often feel when we're encountering rhetoric from a profession or a seemingly professional. These words sound neutral, technical, responsible, but they obscure power. Management of what and by whom? Stewardship for whose benefit? When food becomes an impact and gathering becomes a pressure, the human role in ecosystems disappears, except as a problem to be controlled. This is exactly what scholars like Jessica Hernandez, the former tree hugger guest, has been calling out for years. You cannot separate environmental justice from colonial land governance. Restoration that ignores this is not neutral. It is incomplete. So the struggle to do right, and I want to say this carefully, many of us working in restoration, including myself, are trying to do this better. I've been part of collective work in Seattle that wrestled directly with access, indigenous rights, and limits on existing policy frameworks. That work drew from United Nations declarations, tribal leaderships, and years of community-based listening. Not as a blueprint, not as a finished solution, but as an honest attempt to ask, who are we missing? Globally, the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples is clear. Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional foods and medicines. They have the right to maintain, control, and protect their ecological knowledge. Those are not symbolic rights. They are material. What I see is often a disconnect between these different scales of where people live and on different types of land ownership. So here I do want to give examples of agencies that are beginning to align practice with principle. I don't know about lately, but the federal level, the National Park Service, through tribal gathering agreements and guiding documents, is acknowledging that plants are not just resources, but parts of living cultures. Oregon Metro's Intertribal Cultural Resources Program creates formal pathways for indigenous access, consultation, and stewardship across regional lands. And there does exist at the United States Forest Service traditional gathering policies that recognize customary harvests on certain federal lands and programs, reframing gathering as continuity rather than exception. Again, these efforts are uneven. They don't erase harm, but they show movement, and a new story about foraging is happening. These efforts show what happens when agencies stop asking, how do we control access, and start asking, how do we honor relationship? So I won't tell people how to evade enforcement, but harm reduction matters. That means knowing what land you're on, reading site-specific rules, choosing places where access is explicit, carrying documentation when you're legally gathering, so documentation of the actual policy, like from the book or from the internet, and de-escalating when approached by a Karen or what's the equivalent, Joe or Kevin or whatever, because there is a lot of self-enforcement created that foraging is just illegal and people want to protect nature, not really knowing that they're essentially advocating for policies that criminalize survival or culture. So foraging forces a question restoration can't avoid anymore. Who gets to eat? Not who owns, not who manages, who eats, and who has access to their livelihood and medicine and culture. I truly believe restoration must support human health, livelihoods, and justice, not as side benefits, but as core outcomes. And I think what I'm inviting you to look at is ecology as lived reality, foods, bodies, work, and survival. Land that cannot feed people is not healed. Land that criminalizes relationship is not restored. If we want restoration that lasts, we have to let go of the idea that protection means exclusion. Sometimes it means remembering how to share and remembering or doing the work to remember what our ancestors had access to. So let's return to the plants. Za'atar grows low, spreads slowly, and responds well to careful cutting. You never take the whole plant, you leave the roots, you harvest with restraint. This is ecological literacy. The same is true for berries, camas, nettle, dandelion, and so many others. Or let's pause with nettle. Stinging nettle doesn't ask to be liked. It grows in disturbed soil, along trails, near home sites, Besides rivers that have shifted course, it thrives where the land has been disrupted. It feeds people deeply. It's a superfood, iron-rich, mineral-dense, good for blood, joints, postpartum recovery. You harvest it young before it flowers. You wear gloves, for sure. You move carefully. Disturbance doesn't weaken nettle. It makes it stronger. Now, camas. Blue camas blooms like a quiet sky, but a lot of the beauty is underground. The bulb, slow, growing, and patient, has been a staple food for thousands of years. Camas fields were not wild in the colonial sense. They were tended, burned carefully, weed species removed, harvest rotated. Camas is proof that cultivation and care don't always look like fences and rows. Sometimes they look like a prairie. And hawthorn, twisted trunk, thorns sharp enough to slow you down, white blossoms in spring, red haws in the fall. Hawthorn is heart medicine, literally, and this hits me close to home. The berries and leaves have been used for centuries to support cardiovascular health. It's also a boundary tree. It grows along edges, hedgerows, property lines. Hawthorn reminds us that edges are not empty. They are alive with possibility. Thanks for listening and spending time with us. If you got something out of this conversation, whether it changed the way you think about access, food, land, or ecological relationships, please help us keep this work going. Head over to Grit and Grove Substack and subscribe. Links to all the resources I mentioned today, further reading, and occasional essays that don't fit into the episodes but expand the conversation show up there. You'll also find show notes on the app and at treehuggerpod.com. If you'd like to support the podcast financially, that's incredibly helpful. I cover my time, editing, hosting, and outreach. You can donate through the usual channels found in the show notes. Every contribution helps me stay independent and keeps this work accessible to more people. And if you're listening on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, leave a rating and a review, which really helps other listeners find us. Until next time, take care of each other and take care of those places that feed us. See you in the woods.